In a kingdom where memory was a ministry and history a guarded craft, Alexis Kagame was born into a lineage of keepers. On May 15, 1912, in Kinyarwanda, in northern Rwanda, he arrived in a world still ruled by the Mwami and administered through intricate bonds of clientage. The Abiru, standing at the court's threshold as custodians of the royal code. Kagame's family belonged to that circle, the intellectual aristocracy, charged with remembering and reciting the architecture of power. He would inherit its vocation, but translate it into print, philosophy, and national imagination, walking a path that joined altar, archive, and academy. As a child, he entered missionary classrooms, where the Latin cadence of Catholic catechism met the oral rigor of Rwandan tradition. Baptized in 1928, he was formed by seminary routines at Kabgayi from 1928 to 1933, then Nyakibanda, and ordained a priest in 1941. In these years, Rwanda passed from German to Belgian rule. The monarchy endured, and the Catholic Church ascended. Kagame rose within that ascendance, editing Kinyamateka, the Herald, in the late 1930s and 1940s, a newspaper that placed Kinyarwanda prose in weekly circulation and made room for the confrontation of ideas. Priesthood, for him, was not retreat, but entry into the public square via language and literature. He became, in time, a writer of formidable range. Inganji Karinga, published in 1943, placed the drums and lineages of ancient Rwanda into a written frame. The epic Umulirimbi wa Nili Iberemwa, appearing in 1950 as a 3-volume Christian narrative in Kinyarwanda, extended to 35,000 lines, arranged into 150 cantos, a fusion of pastoral cosmology and Catholic theology. La Poésie dynastique au Rwanda, 1951, and later studies mapped the poetics of power in dynastic praise. Across these works, Kagame said that oral tradition was not an exotic artifact, but a disciplined archive, capable of sustaining philosophical argument and historical narrative. His scholarship was also a defense. In 1952, he wrote Le Code des institutions politiques du Rwanda, articulating a constitutional vision rooted in the logic of clientage and monarchy, a rebuttal to colonial projects that sought to break the social bonds through which authority and protection circulated. The text was controversial enough to prompt his ecclesiastical superiors, under colonial pressure, to send him to Rome. There, at the Gregorian University, he pursued philosophy and joined a circle of African priests exploring how Christianity might serve African national aspirations. In 1950, he had already become the first African admitted to the Institut Royal Colonial Belge, an index of his standing and a sign of the tensions his ideas provoked. The ethnophilosophy for which he is famous took shape in these years. Returning to Rwanda in 1958, he taught and continued compiling oral material from high functionaries of the pre-colonial administration. Promising his informants he would publish full transcripts only after their deaths. His essays on the Bantu philosophy of being used the structures of language, classifiers, verb morphology, metaphoric fields, as traces of ontology. In La Philosophie Bantu comparée, 1976, and earlier work, he argued against dismissals of African thought as pre-logical, demonstrating systematic categories of existence embedded in Kinyarwanda and cognate languages. It was a bold wager that grammar could be a doorway into metaphysics, and that African cosmologies could sit alongside Western philosophy with rigor and dignity. He was not merely cataloging, he was also translating worlds. Kagame's practice of dressing Bantu texts in French was less concession than strategy, an insistence that indigenous concepts retain their integrity even in European idioms. His project had a nationalist scalpel's edge. By shaping a written canon for Kinyarwanda, he was building a cultural foundation for political modernity, asserting a continuity from royal narratives to republican discourse. The scholar as mason, laying stones where oral memory had long carried the weight. The costs of that stance were real. Colonial authorities and segments of the European clergy disliked his research and politics. Portions of his publications were censored. His transcript of the esoteric royal code, recorded in 1945, was confiscated by the colonial military and only appeared in print after independence, first under contested attribution. He was occasionally placed under house arrest. Yet he persisted, using his pen to argue for Africanization within the church and to contest the colonial portrayal of Rwandan institutions as static or tyrannical. He worked with anthropologist Jacques Mackay, whose later influence on social science carried some of Kagame's theses into European academic debates, even as interpretations diverged. Journalist, teacher, priest, Kagame inhabited all three roles as Rwanda approached rupture. The late 1950s and early 1960s brought the death of Mwami Mutara III Rudahigwa, Hutu uprisings, and the end of the monarchy. Parmehutu rose under Gregoire Kayibanda. A republic was proclaimed. A referendum sealed the transition. Independence came in 1962. In this violent reordering, Kagame, marked by association with the royal court and a constitutionalist vision, found himself at historical crosscurrents. He survived the upheaval and entered the new institutions of learning, helping to establish the National University of Rwanda in 1963 and serving as one of its early professors, while maintaining his vocation as a writer-philosopher. His oeuvre never lost its connective tissue: poetry, ethnology, linguistics, history, theology, each an instrument for reconstructing a civilization's self-understanding. He wrote lighter satire too, pieces that teased aristocratic pretensions and played with genre, proving that critique could come dressed in humor. But he returned, again and again, to the tension all his work carried: how to honor the intellectual architecture of monarchy, while facing a republic born in force; how to reconcile sacramental universality with national particularity; how to keep memory from calcifying into myth or dissolving under modern pressure. Kagame's interventions on language were foundational. La langue du Rwanda et du Burundi expliquée aux autochtones, 1960, approached Kinyarwanda and Kirundi with the pair of a philologist and the intention of a nation builder, elevating the vernacular to a medium of high discourse. His comparative method treated Bantu language families not as mere vehicles of communication, but as archives of philosophy. Each noun class a category of being, each semantic pattern a trace of cosmology. The claim was controversial, but it cracked open a field and inspired African philosophers to excavate indigenous concepts with scholarly discipline. If his political vision, constitutional monarchy, reform through Christian ethics, and modern administrative law, was overtaken by events, his deeper ambition endured: to secure a dignified place for African intellectual systems within global scholarship. He was a bridge because he refused to be a derivative copy. He did not ask Europe for validation. He argued with Europe, sometimes in its language, often with examples it struggled to apprehend, and always with the authority of someone who knew the inner workings of the tradition he described. He died unexpectedly on December 2nd, 1981, in Nairobi, at 69. Death came at a distance from the courtly spaces of his youth and the classrooms of his maturity. But the line he traced from oral recitation to printed page remained. He had given Rwanda a written mirror in which to see itself. He had given African philosophy a seat at an often hostile table, and he had left behind a bibliography that future scholars would sift for the origins of a discipline still defining its terms. Measured against the century's tragic arcs, Kagame's legacy is strikingly constructive. He did not rally militias or draft manifestos for insurrection. He built a library. He asserted that a nation's future could be imagined in its own words, articulated through forms that had long carried authority before colonization. He reminded readers that what is called tradition can be a living method, capable of sustaining reform without erasure. When we speak of him now, it is as priest, poet, linguist, philosopher, titles that reflect not hierarchy, but the braided nature of his work. The Abiru memory keeper became the modern scholar. The Catholic editor became the builder of Kinyarwanda's print literature. The constitutionalist became at last a witness to radical transition. Through it all, Alexis Kagame treated language as homeland and literature as constitution, arguing that nations are held together not only by laws and borders, but by the forms in which they tell their truth.